Hello, it's Ruby, and today I am going to be sharing my top 5 books that I've read so far in 2022. Before we start this video, I've got myself some tea, of course, because I feel like you can't have a video talking about books without tea. Is that unfair to say? I don't think it's unfair to say. I'm going to push you back so you can see the tea tray. This is actually a coffee cup, but I really like it. It's been one of my favourites recently, and so I'm going to use that. The tea that I'm using is Chocolate Digestive from Bird & Blend, which is my favourite tea, or one of my favourite teas. I've got multiple favourite teas. I've got multiple favourite teas depending on when I'm having them, but Chocolate Digestive is definitely one of my favourites, and it's my go-to milky tea. It literally tastes and smells like chocolate digestive biscuits, and so to go along with it too, I have got a digestive biscuit. Last year I did a video of my top 21 books I've read so far in 2021. I had a pretty non-intense, like, academic term last term. I had time to read, but I just wasn't reading as much. I just wasn't reading books as much. I still have read 56 books this year, so this is utterly subjective, me being like, oh, I've hardly read anything, but actually a lot of those books are children's books because I did a children's literature module. Totally agree with C.S. Lewis, who says, I'm going to find the quote, it's a wonderful quote. So he said, a children's story that can only be enjoyed by children isn't a good children's story in the slightest. So I might have read as many books as I usually would, but I haven't spent as much time reading books because a lot of those books were a lot shorter. And I have read some really good books this year, but just not as many. What I've been trying to do instead, like, I feel like I'd started to fall into this trap of reading books because I should read them. It's almost for the sake of reading them. If I started a book but didn't like it, then I'd still finish it because only then could I count it as having read it. But what's the point in that? I mean, that's so superficial, it doesn't make any sense. And it's only this year I've really recognised that. So this year, there are lots of things I've read which I wouldn't count as like having read this year. So things like poetry or dipping into a short story collection, just reading an excerpt from a diary or something. I've been doing a lot more of that. It feels like I'm really reading for the right reasons. I actually haven't had chocolate digestive tea in a while. The first book is one that I read very recently, which is A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and I actually did read this in a readathon, so you saw my initial thoughts and you saw me reading that in that video if you watched it. This is an essay. It's not very long at all. I think it's like 60 pages, 86 pages. This is an essay by Virginia Woolf about the disparity between men and women when it comes to writing literature, and basically how men have historically been the ones writing books. So Virginia Woolf has been asked to give a lecture at Oxford about women and fiction, and she's ruminating on this, she's contemplating it. What does this mean? What does she talk about with this? What kind of thing can she cover under this very broad heading, women and literature, which is a very broad, very broad thing. Of course, you'd never, or it's very unlikely that you'd be asked to give a lecture on men and fiction, because male writers are the default, especially when she's writing in She was born in 1882. This is almost like a piece of fiction. It almost reads like a story. It takes place over 2 days where Virginia Woolf has been asked to give this lecture, and then she's walking around Oxford and she's basically planning the lecture in her head, and she's bringing us along that process with her. And actually at first when I started reading it, I didn't realise it was an essay. I had no idea. I didn't know anything about this before I picked it up. And so at first, yeah, I thought, yes, this is a story. Then realised it was an essay, and I really think it's cool how she's blurring the line between those two things. So in this though, we do see Woolf think about women in literature kind of chronologically, so thinking about them like in the 15th century and then tracking them forwards. One of the things that she talks about, for example, is Shakespeare's sister. If Shakespeare's sister wanted to be a writer, what would she have said? And uses that as a great juxtaposition to Shakespeare and the fact that Shakespeare was able to write because he was a man. The crux of it is women didn't have time to be writers because they were doing other things. They were in the home. They didn't have a room of their own in which to write. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the space. And so it is recognising that privilege is a massive part of writing, and I think therefore that this book can be applied to inequality in writing in the world today. We all have stories to tell, and yet there are so many factors which can prevent people from telling their stories. Things like literacy, education. If you haven't had access to education and can't write, then writing a book obviously becomes difficult. If you're working 3 jobs, you don't have time to write a book. I think the crux of this book and like the main messaging can be applied elsewhere, like the core of what the book is saying. Of course, it's important to recognise that Virginia Woolf herself is writing from a very privileged position. She's been given an inheritance, she has a room of her own, she is able to write, and so yes, it is coming from a privileged place, but I also think that she is acknowledging that privilege, especially at the end of the book, spoilers, where she's addressing the women listening to her lecture and saying, yes, because you do have this education, because you do have a room of your own, you have an obligation to write, you have an obligation to tell people's stories, women's stories that they weren't able to tell before. So basically I really enjoyed this, very, very good. I'd tentatively say that if you enjoyed reading this, you should have a try at Emily Dickinson's Letters, Sylvia Plath's journals, possibly The Bell Jar as well. Also The Yellow Wallpaper and On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. And also read Margaret Atwood's On Writers and Writing, which is a collection of essays about the process of writing. Book number 2 is very different, one of the first books I read this year, which is Poison for Breakfast by Lemony Snicket. Yes, this is a children's book, but remember what I said earlier about C.S. Lewis. First though, let's have another cup of tea. This is by the incredible Lemony Snicket, or Daniel Handler, who wrote the series of Unfortunate Events books, of course. I really hope that you read when you were younger, and if you didn't, I would highly recommend you reading them now. I actually reread them for my children's literature module, and they were even better reading them now because he's such an incredible children's writer, and he's so good at connecting with the reader and recognising the reader is like a real person, which I think is very unusual in children's books. There are some books which do it very well, like How to Be Brave by Daisy Mae Johnson, but for the most part I would say it's not done enough. The really cool thing that happens in Series of Unfortunate Events is Lemony Snicket, who is the author, it literally becomes a character in the book and is a part of the narrative. The really funny thing that we see with the Series of Unfortunate Events is in the kind of spin-off books which have come from the series, which often happen, you know, with Harry Potter you've got Tales of the Beadle and the Bard, with Peculiar Home, Peculiar Children you've got Tales of the Peculiar, but with the Series of Unfortunate Events books, instead the spin-offs are about Lemony Snicket. Lemony Snicket has also written the unauthorised biography of him. We've got the Beatrice Letters, and now we've got Poison for Breakfast, and all of these focus on Lemony Snicket as a character and as an author. I think he is such a cool character, this mysterious, very eccentric author who for some reason is tracking the lives of the Baudelaire children, thinks in just really interesting ways, and it's kind of exactly what we as children imagine authors to be. This book is not fast-paced, it's not plot-driven in the way that his other books are, and in a way I would actually say that it is like an adult's book. I don't know, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed this much as a child, but I really enjoyed reading it now. So in this book, Lemony Snicket ingests poison at breakfast. He's left a note saying, "You have eaten poison," and he goes through everything he's eaten for breakfast and tries to track down and figure out what poisoned him. before he dies, basically. So it's quite funny actually, because this is how he decides to spend his last day, thinking that he has been poisoned. He's trying to solve that mystery. It's funny, isn't it, the things that do end up preoccupying us, but actually, is that a bad thing? It gives us purpose, it makes life interesting, and that's exactly what Lemony Snicket shows in this, because through tracking down where his bread came from, where his eggs came from, interesting things happen. He sees and he observes interesting things, and he has stories to tell. It's the whole thing of like destination not mattering, journey mattering. So he goes, "This morning I had poison for breakfast. This book is about bewilderment, a word which here means the feeling of being bewildered. And bewildered is a word which here means you don't have any idea what's happening. And you is a word which doesn't just mean you, it means everyone. You have no idea what is happening. And nobody you know has any idea what is happening. And of course there are people you don't know, which is most of the people in the world, and they don't know what's happening either. And of course I don't know what is happening, or I wouldn't have eaten poison for breakfast." It's just brilliantly hilarious. He's so astute and funny and interesting, and like honestly I would say Lemony Snicket is one of my favourite characters in literature. So the thing that he has for breakfast is tea with honey, a piece of toast with cheese, one sliced pear and an egg perfectly prepared. He repeats this kind of as a refrain the whole way through the book. So this is a wonderful story where he like goes through tea, then the honey, and like tries to find where the poison came from, and there isn't really a plot as such. It's literally just him following that. There's not a driving force. It's not a page turner, but it's reflective and it's clever and it's a joy to read. In Series of Unfortunate Events, you might remember that Lemony Snicket tends to go on like a few rambles sometimes, like he'll define words, or he might tell an anecdote, he might make a very strange comparison between two things, and that's taken to the extreme in this book. That's basically what the whole book is. It's like one extended footnote or one extended aside. I think Lemony Snicket is brilliant. Daniel Handler, he's so observant. I would say he is the modern painter of modern life, as Baudelaire says. Baudelaire, haha. If you enjoyed this, I would say that the adult equivalent to Lemony Snicket is probably David Sedaris, who is very different, but he has a similar sense of humour, and so if you enjoyed this, or if you enjoyed series when you were younger, then I would recommend that. The next book is Once Again to Zelda, 50 Great Dedications and Their Stories by Marlene Wagman-Geller. Marlene Wagman-Geller is a self-proclaimed dedication detective. Book dedications are so overlooked in literature, and yet they preface pretty much every book, since the Victorian period especially. Dedications have basically featured in the opening to every book. A lot of attention has been paid to those like early modern dedications where people were dedicating plays and books to their patrons. People never pay attention to dedications in modern books, and that's exactly what this book has done. I think she has a blog as well where she talks through dedications. This is like 50 very short stories about different authors and where their dedications came from, and like their relationship with the person that they dedicated the book to. These are like 4-page stories about an author's life, and she manages to condense it in a really interesting, engaging way. Funnily enough, I would say that like in terms of form, they resemble fairy tales because they are so short and they're quite non-specific. It's not like you've got conversations playing out. It's on a very broad scale. But there are so many examples here. We've got, of course, Once Again to Zelda. That's a reference to F. Scott Fitzgerald, who dedicated many of his books to his wife Zelda, and they had a very strange relationship, complicated relationship, which Wagman-Geller explores. More so than reading this because you're interested in dedications, the interesting thing, the thing that I like about it, is that it gives an insight into authors' lives. I really want to be an author myself, and that's my like ultimate dream. So actually I found myself getting very inspired from reading this book because I was reading about great authors, and also found some really good book recommendations through this because she doesn't just choose the really obvious ones. So we've obviously got things like Jane Eyre, Frankenstein, also got other books like The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, which I hadn't read before, and I read it after reading the story behind that book. I don't know, it's a really cool way to be introduced to some new literature. It's like the antithesis to Death of the Author though. Okay, if you enjoyed this, what book can I recommend? Possibly something like Speeches That Changed the World. I'd recommend this if you like fast-paced history books, so things like Remember the Alamo, or books also published in this collection. Something like The French Revolution by Christopher Hibbert as well, because in a similar way, it's a very broad way of storytelling. Okay, number 4 is a really exciting one, and I didn't realise that this book had come out until I was in Waterstones with Blakeney for my birthday. She said I could choose a book and she'd buy me the book as part of my present, which was so nice, honestly, because we always go into bookshops and then we don't end up buying anything because I don't know. And I saw this on one of the stands, literally had just come out. So Blakely got it for me for my birthday, which is so, so nice. And guess what? It is signed by E. Lockhart, which we love. I was very excited to see that. E. Lockhart wrote We Were Liars. It's in my top 3 YA books. This is the prequel to We Were Liars, but you should read it after reading We Were Liars because there are spoilers as to what happens at the end of that. Like, please, please, please don't read this first. This is about one of Katie's aunts. It's Johnny's mother, Carrie, and a summer in the 1970s with her sisters. Obviously, these are in 2 completely different time frames. We have different characters, and yet they are still very, very clearly related, and they deal with the same themes of like wealth inequality and also gender inequality in this one. The writing style is also very similar to We Were Liars. It's that same like lyrical, poetic, short sentences, almost like poetry style. So let's choose an early page so I don't accidentally spoil anything. Lots of line breaks, which is very characteristic of We Were Liars. Very, very intimate as well. So we grow very close to the narrator and she's very honest with us, which I think is cool. So in We Were Liars and this, it's about a private island which a family owns off from Martha's Vineyard. They go there every summer for the whole summer. This summer, however, is slightly different because a group of boys have come to stay. Carrie falls in love with one of them, and so it's a love story, but also so much more than that. I don't tend to like romance stories alone. I don't know, it's not soppy in the way that a lot of romance books are. So I appreciate that and I love this book. I did not want to finish it and I just really hope that she does another prequel, which is like another 30 years before that with the mother and father, because I think that would be really cool. And then I'm also going to have like a joint number 4 because I could not choose. I read another Lockhart book, The Disreputable History of Frankie Landau Banks, which is a slightly older book of hers. I got this book out of my library, so I don't have a physical copy to share with you. Please, please support your local libraries. There are so many good books that they have stocked there, and it's a much cheaper, more accessible way of accessing books. Just by taking out a book, we are helping to keep these institutions going. Libraries are so valuable and so many of them are closing, so it's just important to remember to keep on supporting your local library. This book again deals with those same themes of wealth inequality and gender inequality again. It's set in a privileged mixed boarding school, and Frankie has had a glow up over the summer. Before she was a bit nerdy. Now she's getting a lot more attention from boys and things. So it's that very stereotypical before and after scene that we have in all of the early 2000s chick flick films, but I really like how Frankie is kind of aware of this and she doesn't like it, and she hates how people are treating her differently, and she recognises that it's fault that people treat you differently because of how you look. She starts going out with this boy and hears about this exclusive all boys club which exists within the school, and she knows that her father was also part of this group when he was at the school, and girls aren't allowed into this group. Frankie tries to infiltrate this. She tries to be the first girl to be a part of this gang, and she's so fiery and she's just doing everything she can to dismantle the way that this club works and to basically prove that girls could be a part of this club. It's really, really cool. I love her as a character. She's one of my favourite characters in literature I think I've come across in a while. She's not particularly likeable per se, like I think I'd be very intimidated by her if she were here right now beside me, but she's fiery and she knows her own mind and she's confident and she's clever, and I just think she's a really cool female character. She actually reminds me a lot of Rennie in The Distance Home by Paula Saunders. The really cool thing about this book though, the thing that means it made it onto this list, yes, it was a really enjoyable thing to read, but also I love how it plays with form. I really enjoy books that experiment with form and try something new and don't just stick to like the classic way of writing. This whole book is laid out like a kind of police report. So we know at the beginning that Frankie has done something. She's done something wrong and the police are trying to track her down. We know that at the beginning. The whole thing is like a case file trying to figure out what she did, what happened, and we go with them on this journey of like trying to figure out what happened. We don't know why the author is interested in her and what she's done, but she must be interesting if they're writing this book about her. I'd say, okay, if you enjoyed Family of Lies and The Disreputable History of Frankie Landau Banks, the books I would recommend would be A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, of course, that whole series. Also One of Us is Lying. Okay, and then finally I want to recommend Fierce Bad Rabbits. It gives a history of children's picture books and the stories behind them, why they came about. So for example, The Tiger Who Came for Tea, kind of what's the reasoning behind that, what was the cultural impact of that. And it basically explores how picture books are hugely influential on culture, children's lives, like the people that we become, as I was saying earlier. It does offer like criticism of picture books, and it is taking a critical stance on them. So it is almost an academic piece of writing, but it's super accessible and just written in a really engaging way. The author connects it to her own experiences reading these books or reading them to her children, and it comes from a place of like she's just become a mother, and so she's thinking about like the books that her children are reading. So it's I don't know, I think it's a really cool example of the way that academic writing can go. Academic writing is often very inaccessible and kind of like trying to maybe be more complicated than it needs to be. Maybe it's more useful for academic writing to be more publicly accessible, to be something which we can apply to the real world and learn from, and like kind of see how these things actually interact with our everyday lives, because they do. It goes through chronologically, so we've got Beatrix Potter, Tiger Came to Tea, as I say. When I read this book, I definitely did have some of the stigma myself against picture books as not being like as, not as important, but like not as carefully crafted. I've been a long-time proponent of middle grade fiction and YA fiction doing really interesting, important things and being very well crafted, but not for picture books. And this book totally changed my perspective on that, because picture books are working in cool ways and they are doing cool things, and we actually had to write picture books on my module, and it's not as easy as just like, you know, writing a quick story. There's so much that has to go into it, and you're dealing with like very impressionable young minds here, so you have to be careful. This book really acknowledges that. A really good example of this is Sea Prep, which is about a father and son coming over from Syria as refugees, as asylum seekers, and it's a really good way of opening up those conversations with young children through picture books. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really want to do more book related videos. I love filming videos like this. Please let me know if there are any in particular you'd like me to do, or if there's anything in particular you'd like to see. Just finishing my tea as well, I've got one cup left. Just a little note as well at the end, academic planner. I've said this in my last few videos, but we're releasing this in mid-July if you're interested in purchasing it. I'm so excited to release this. It's been a long time in the making, and I've added a lot more since the last one, like really tried to tailor it and perfect it so it can be as good as it can be. Yeah, so anyway, I hope you have a productive week, and I encourage you right now to pick up a book and read something. I'm actually going to go downstairs right now and read some more of The Binding, which I'm loving. This has been on my TBR on my bookshelf for years, like since it came out in 2019. And I just hadn't read it, and I started it last night, and it's just exquisite. It's like the Night Circus kind of vibes. Anyway, I will see you soon.